about and investigating. We took that information and really tried to match it with some of the criteria we had about indicators as being relevant to our values and interests, as being usable by the social equity constituents as well as by SACOG, and then really having sources of data that are reliable and consistent that we can use not just for this process, but really thinking about moving forward. One of the interesting things in terms of the broad areas that was added in that discussion was a real concern not just about jobs, but really about small businesses and really thinking about the business environment in these neighborhoods. So we added a whole category of a set of indicators trying to look at sales growth and change in small businesses at a neighborhood level and how that compares across the region. And also some more specific indicators on social vulnerabilities. Single parenthood was one of the key issues that was in there. Linguistic isolation was another one. So then just yesterday we had our second meeting. Again, a fairly large group, somewhat smaller than the first meeting, about 20 people or so. And really they were giving us feedback on what you all should have in front of you stapled to the agenda. And what we proposed was really a couple things. One, the first sheet is really laying out some of the demographic variables that we will help to map and provide data both overall for the region and then individually for TPAs that seem to be most important. And then within each of those two broad categories of vulnerability and opportunity, we tried to divide up the indicators into two broad sets. One are the things that actually can be incorporated into that index. So we would have that sort of headline indicator for the individual TPAs. And that's the first sheet of paper in each case. As we looked in more detail at the data, we realized that there's a lot of data that's not easily combined into an index. Maybe it's specific data on performance in schools, or the data comes at a school district level, or maybe it's a walkability score that's trying to measure relationship to multiple different point sources, and that's a lot harder to figure out how to incorporate into an index than information that's available at a census tract level. So what we're proposing is to have that index as we originally suggested, but then also to provide a set of analysis based on some of the individual equity indicators or social indicators that might not fit into the index. And so what we're proposing to do is to really provide an equity analysis or implications of specific TPAs that are proposed by the local jurisdictions that we'll get back on May 13th. And we'll have these kind of broad indicators and indexes for the whole region. But the third meeting that we're proposing, which will happen in early June, is, to the extent we're able in that short time frame, to provide that specific data for each of the individual TPAs that are proposed around the region, and not to rank them, because part of what came out of our discussions was that what we really would like to see in terms of considering social equity is really a variety of different conditions. And that's really for maximizing this as a learning opportunity. This is the first time we're going through SB 375 processes. There'll be a variety of different experiences, and you may want a TPA that is in a relatively well-off neighborhood at the moment, where some of the challenges may be, how do we get more affordable housing into that region? Whereas you may want another TPA in a very difficult neighborhood, and with the challenge there may be, how do we attract businesses and jobs to that area? And that if you're concerned about equity, we really want to be thinking about that whole range of sort of impact and feasibility factors. And so what we hope to be able to do then is not to rank TPAs, but really to provide some more in-depth analysis of, if we're to consider equity as a top priority, what would be the implications of considering this particular TPA, and how would that differ from looking at other TPAs?
Let me ask you the same question I did Bill in terms of participation. How are you feeling about the geographic representation? Do you have all the price points represented in your group?
Well, it's a very good question. I've been thinking about that. One of the key constituencies that I think has not been very active that we would like to see more of is labor unions. Broad constituency concerned about equity, but haven't been that engaged in this sort of planning process. Right. I'd say we're also overrepresented in Sacramento-based constituencies in the city. I think we have less representation from some of the somewhat more outlying suburbs. Folsom, we'd love to see more Rancho Cordova. We although have some representation of that. And I would say somewhat less from Marysville, Yuba, or some of the more rural areas. So I think that would be important as well.
Okay. Stacy.
All right. Well, the Natural Resources Group has met one time so far. We met back on April 21st. Good representation. I think we had roughly 20 people there. Unlike Bill and Chris, and the Natural Resources, well, I'm going to separate myself. We may be very much alike, but I feel special that with the natural resources piece...
There are some differences.
You're special.
On the natural resources side, for the Sustainable Communities Initiative, there are some very technical issues which need to be resolved. And much of those issues are directly linked to engagement with federal and state agencies. So our working group, when we met for the first time, very much did a similar brainstorm on the indicators for the TPAs. But the benefit to me, not only in that process, was to listen and hear what some of those indicators may be for whatever projects bubble up as being the 4 to 5 that are ultimately chosen, but what are the things that we could potentially be looking at as we develop the EIR for the MTP, which Mike discussed. In terms of some of the issues that did come to the forefront for the Natural Resources Working Group, some were very, I would say, project specific, such as making sure that there are best management practices and low impact development standards when we look at projects. Definitely existing infrastructure in the way of water, so we don't have intense impacts to, particularly there was an underscore of any listed species. There was a strong consensus in our group that if there was a nexus to listed species, that those projects should fall down to the more bottom layering of the of a potential TPA list. Definitely a lot of interest, and I see Larry Green in the back, on air quality and VMT naturally. These things are always analyzed, but with a more robust environmental document being contemplated for the MTP, understanding how we may build more of those indicators into that document to better influence CEQA streamlining not only for the projects that will ultimately be chosen in that handful, but of all potential TPAs throughout the life of this Metropolitan Transportation Plan. I was also very encouraged, and it was nice to have a good representation of folks who are interested in urban forestry, greening, access to trails. There was a nice consensus in the group that we do not want to create transit priority areas that have no livability standard, that are just based on transit and based on jobs and affordable housing, but also we want to make sure that they're places that people would want to live and recreate. I also got a very strong sense from our group that there is great interest in what is in Joe's presentation, comes at the end of this process, but I think will be an iterative discussion as we move forward, and that is this regional plan for sustainable development. There's understanding within the Natural Resources Group, and particularly as we go through these different charges that, as I say, are sometimes very directly associated with federal agencies, that the concept of a transit priority area and incentivizing growth and development in that fashion is agreed to be an excellent one. If we cannot address regulatory hurdles or local zoning issues, we can come up with some excellent ideas, but they'll be very difficult to implement. So I think, honestly, our group will spend a tremendous amount of our effort looking forward to that regional plan for sustainable development. How do we do a good job, which SACOG frankly has done an excellent job of stitching together the expansive amount of data that has been collected in this region for initiatives like Blueprint and RUCS and various general plans and so forth. But to take that information and help determine